can't believe I'm about to write this, but I need to get it off my chest, and this is the only place I can think of where people might actually understand. This whole thing started with a stupid decision, a decision I regret more than anything. I bought a mystery box from the dark web. Yeah, I know, I can already hear people saying, "Why the hell would you do something like that?" Honestly, I didn't even have a good reason. I was just bored, curious, maybe a little drunk. It started as one of those late-night rabbit holes where you go deeper and deeper into the weirdest parts of the internet. Eventually, I found myself on a dark web forum that sold mystery boxes, claiming to offer everything from harmless junk to, well, much worse. I'm not sure why I thought it was a good idea to go for it. Maybe it was the thrill of not knowing what I'd get. Maybe it was the adrenaline of doing something so obviously wrong. I convinced myself it was just a weird internet trend. No way these things are as bad as people say, I thought. What's the worst that could happen? Turns out, a lot. I placed an order through some sketchy payment system. The box wasn't cheap either, about $500 worth of crypto. It felt like throwing money into a black hole, but 2 weeks later, a plain cardboard box showed up on my doorstep. No return address, no markings, just a box that looked like it could have come from any regular store. My heart was pounding. I stood there staring at it for a while, already regretting my decision. But curiosity got the better of me, and I brought it inside. At first, it seemed underwhelming. I opened the box and found a bunch of random crap. There was a broken Polaroid camera, some old VHS tapes, and a weirdly heavy doll that looked like it had been through hell. The doll was the worst part so far. It had no eyes, just empty sockets that stared back at me, and it was stained with what looked like blood. I told myself it was probably just some creepy prank. I even laughed a bit, thinking I'd been scammed by some twisted joker on the internet. But then I found the last thing at the bottom of the box. That's when everything changed. It was a small envelope, sealed with a red wax stamp. When I peeled it open, a key fell out, along with a crumpled piece of paper. The note was barely legible, but the words were clear enough. Use the key. The drawer. It's in your house. I froze. That sentence, those words, didn't make any sense. How the hell could they know about a drawer in my house? I don't even have a drawer with a keyhole. My mind started racing, but part of me thought it was all just part of the prank. Maybe they were just guessing, trying to freak me out. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. After a few hours of pacing around my apartment, I started inspecting every piece of furniture in my place, trying to find something, anything that could fit that key. I was half laughing at myself at this point, telling myself it was just a waste of time. But then I found it. There was a small drawer at the back of my closet, hidden behind some old boxes. I'd never noticed it before, and I've lived in this place for almost 3 years. It was small, barely big enough to fit a few papers, and sure enough, it had a tiny keyhole. My hands were shaking as I slid the key in. It turned easily, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. When I pulled the drawer open, the smell hit me first, like rotting meat, thick and rancid. I gagged, covering my mouth, but I couldn't stop myself from looking inside. It was a mess of torn fabric and what looked like old leather straps, all stained with dark, crusty patches. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Wedged underneath the mess was what looked like a small human hand, pale and limp. I recoiled, stumbling back as the drawer slammed shut, but the image burned into my mind. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. It had to be fake, right? There's no way... I mean, it didn't look real, but at the same time, it didn't look fake either. Panic started to creep in. I needed to get rid of it. I ran out of my apartment, hoping the fresh air would calm me down. But all I could think about was that tiny hand. When I got back inside, I opened the drawer again, desperate to convince myself that it was all just some elaborate prank. But the hand was gone. The fabric, the leather straps, they were all still there. But the hand was nowhere to be found. I stood there, confused, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I heard it, a faint knocking sound. Not from the door, but from inside my apartment, like someone was tapping very softly on the walls. My blood ran cold. It was coming from the closet, the same closet where I found the drawer. I slowly stepped toward it, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the knocking anymore. I swung the closet door open, but nothing was there, except that damn drawer, still slightly ajar. I should have stopped there. I should have packed my bags and left, called the police, something, but I didn't. I needed to know what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight and started searching the back of the closet, pulling everything out. And that's when I saw it. Something was written on the back wall in dark red smears. "Help me!" My entire body went numb. The letters were smeared like someone had scratched them into the wall with their bare hands. And as I stared at the words, the knocking started again, louder this time, more desperate. I'm not proud of what I did next. I ran. I grabbed my car keys and left the apartment without looking back. I spent the night in a cheap motel, too terrified to even close my eyes. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was all a bad dream, a sick hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But when I got back to my apartment, the drawer was still there, and the words were still smeared on the wall. I called the police. I didn't know what else to do. When they arrived, I told them everything about the mystery box, the drawer, the hand, the writing. They took one look inside the drawer and their faces went pale. They didn't say much after that, just told me to leave the apartment and that someone would contact me later. That was 2 days ago. I haven't heard back from them yet. But last night, when I tried to sleep, I heard the knocking again. And this time, it didn't stop. After the cops left my place, I didn't hear anything for 2 whole days. I stayed at that dingy motel, constantly jumping at the smallest sounds, the hum of the air conditioner, the distant chatter from the room next door. Everything felt like a threat. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something waiting for me to come back. I didn't know if it was the drawer, the hand, or something worse. I had no clue what the hell I was dealing with. On the 3rd day, I got a call. It wasn't from the police like I'd been expecting, but from my landlord. The guy was furious, talking about how the cops had shown up at the building and basically forced their way into my apartment. I tried explaining what happened, but he cut me off, told me I had 1 week to get my stuff and leave, said I was a liability, and he wasn't dealing with whatever mess I was involved in. I can't blame him. If I were in his shoes, I'd probably do the same. But still, hearing those words hit me hard. I'd lived in that apartment for years. It was supposed to be my safe space, and now it was something out of a nightmare. After that call, I had no choice. I needed to go back. But the idea of stepping into that place again made my skin crawl. It's hard to describe the feeling, a mix of dread and the kind of paranoia that eats away at your brain. Every second that passed, the more I felt like that box had cursed me. I don't believe in that kind of stuff usually, but this was different. This felt real. I headed back to my apartment in the middle of the day. I thought going during the daylight might make things easier, but the minute I stepped inside, it was like walking into a different world. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and there was this smell, rotten, like something had died and was just sitting there decaying. It wasn't there before. I swore it wasn't. I grabbed a bandana from my pocket and tied it around my face, trying to block out the stench. My heart was racing the entire time as I packed up the essentials, clothes, my laptop, some personal stuff. I tried to avoid looking at the closet, but it felt like it was calling to me.
like something in there was waiting for me to come closer. I know it sounds insane, but it was this weird nagging pull. And then I made the mistake of checking my phone. I don't know what made me do it, but I had this compulsion to look through my notifications. There were a few missed calls from unknown numbers and a voicemail. The voicemail was short, nothing but heavy breathing, followed by a weird static sound. I almost dropped my phone when I heard it. I listened to it over and over, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't normal breathing. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was standing right next to me, watching. I couldn't stay. I rushed to grab the last of my things, but before I could leave, my eyes darted to the closet door. The drawer. That damn drawer was still slightly open. I told myself not to look. I should have just left it alone. But my body moved on its own. I stepped closer, pulled the drawer all the way out and looked inside. At first I thought it was empty, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something small tucked into the back corner. A phone. Not a normal one either. It was one of those old burner-style phones. It was off, but the moment I touched it, the screen flickered to life.
The only thing on the screen was a single message. "Look inside the wall." My entire body froze. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, or if someone was really sending these messages to me. I checked the closet walls, running my hands over the surface until I felt it, a soft patch, like the drywall had been cut and patched back up. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my pocket knife and started cutting into it. The material crumbled easily, like it had been hastily done. Behind the wall was a small compartment, and inside, God, I can barely bring myself to describe what I found. There was a Ziploc bag, sealed tightly, and inside the bag were photographs. I don't know how old they were, but they looked like they had been taken with an old-school camera. The photos showed a girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old. Her eyes were wide open, but lifeless, staring blankly into the camera. She was bound, gagged, and in some of the pictures you could see someone standing over her, holding a knife. I felt sick. My stomach churned as I flipped through the rest of the photos, each one worse than the last. The same girl, in different states of mutilation. I gagged, stumbling back, dropping the bag to the floor. And then I heard the knocking again. This time, it was louder, more frantic, like someone was desperately trying to get my attention. It was coming from all around me, inside the walls, underneath the floorboards, even the ceiling. The sound was deafening, echoing through the entire apartment. I ran out of there as fast as I could, barely making it to my car before the panic overwhelmed me. I drove to the nearest police station, the photographs still burning a hole in my mind. When I handed them over to the officer at the front desk, he looked at me like I was insane. They took me into a back room, asked me all kinds of questions. Where I found the photos, who the girl was, if I knew anything about her.
I told them everything, from the mystery box to the drawer to the message on the phone. The whole time, they kept exchanging these weird glances, like they didn't believe me. They said they'd investigate, but I could tell they thought I was just some lunatic. They kept the photos, and after what felt like hours of interrogation, they let me go. But as I walked out of the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. The knocking, I swear I could still hear it, faint but persistent, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that girl's face, her lifeless eyes, her broken body. And the worst part, the knocking didn't stop. It got louder, more aggressive, until I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag, grabbed my car keys, and left town without looking back. But no matter how far I drove, the knocking followed. Leaving town didn't stop anything. I thought getting as far away from that cursed apartment would make the knocking stop, that I could leave whatever was happening behind me like it was some kind of twisted nightmare that only existed within those walls. But I was wrong, dead wrong. After driving for hours, I found a cheap motel somewhere off the highway, the kind of place that looks like it hasn't been updated since the 70s, where the wallpaper peels at the corners and the air smells faintly of mildew. I didn't care. I just needed a place to crash, to escape the insanity for a while. The first night was quiet. No knocking, no weird noises, just a heavy silence that felt almost too still. I started to believe I'd outrun whatever was happening to me. Maybe the knocking was in my head, a result of stress or paranoia. I convinced myself that I was safe, but the second night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything that had happened. The images of that poor girl from the photos were burned into my brain, her lifeless eyes haunting every thought. I tried to shake it off, but it was like she was etched into my mind, refusing to leave. That's when I heard it again. At first it was faint, almost like it was far off in the distance. A soft, rhythmic tapping, barely noticeable. I sat up, straining to listen. It didn't make sense. I was hundreds of miles away from my apartment. There was no way the knocking could have followed me here. I told myself it was just someone next door. Thin motel walls, right? That kind of thing happens. But the sound grew louder, and this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from underneath me. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding so loud I thought it'd explode out of my chest. The floor beneath me started to thump, like someone was trapped down there, pounding with both fists, trying to get out. The sound was relentless, aggressive. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was desperate. Something wanted out. I backed away from the bed, trying to make sense of it, but before I could move any further, I heard something else. A voice. Faint, barely audible over the pounding, but unmistakable. Help! Me! My blood turned to ice. It was the same voice I'd heard on the voicemail. That low, breathy voice, like someone struggling to breathe, whispering from just beneath the floorboards. Help! Me! I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, threw on my jacket, and bolted for the door. But the moment my hand touched the doorknob, the lights in the room flickered and went out. I froze, surrounded by complete darkness, the knocking louder now than it had ever been. My phone. I fumbled for it, my hands trembling, desperate to use the flashlight. The light flicked on, casting a small beam in the pitch-black room. That's when I saw it.
The bed, the one I had just been lying in, was moving. Not shaking or vibrating like you'd expect with an earthquake, but slowly, like it was being pushed from underneath. I aimed the light at the floor, and I could see it. Something was pressing up from beneath the boards, the wood warping and cracking as if something was trying to break through. I backed into the corner of the room, my breath shallow, panic choking me as I watched the floorboards split open. I couldn't move. My feet were cemented to the floor, my eyes locked on that spot in the center of the room. And then, through the crack in the boards, I saw it. A hand. Pale, withered, and small, just like the one I'd seen in the drawer at my apartment. The hand pushed through the gap in the floor, dragging itself upward. Slowly, painfully, another arm emerged. And then a face, sunken, hollow eyes staring up at me, expressionless and void of life. It was her, the girl from the photographs. She was crawling out of the floor, her limbs twisted and contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, her body dragging along the ground as though she were fighting against some unseen force pulling her back down. I screamed so loud my throat felt like it was tearing apart, but no one heard me. The motel was eerily quiet, as if the world had stopped around me. I slammed my fist against the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled or kicked, it wouldn't open. I was trapped. The girl's head turned toward me, her eyes locking onto mine, but they weren't blank anymore. There was something in them, something dark and angry. She opened her mouth, and a low, guttural sound escaped her lips, like a mix between a growl and a scream. "Help! Me?" she said again. Only this time, the words weren't a plea, they were a command. I backed up further, pressing myself into the corner of the room, my hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped my phone. The beam of light flickered across the room as I tried to keep the girl in view, but she wasn't moving toward me. She was just standing there now, halfway out of the floor, staring at me with those horrible dead eyes. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The knocking, the crawling, everything. She disappeared back into the floor, leaving nothing behind but the cracked boards and the smell of decay that clung to the air like a suffocating blanket. The lights flickered back on, and the door, as if by some twisted joke, unlocked with a soft click. I didn't waste a second. I burst through the door, running to my car and speeding out of that place like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, pulling into a parking lot outside a 24-hour diner. I spent the rest of the night in my car, shaking, barely able to breathe. What the hell was happening to me? That girl. She wasn't just some ghost or spirit. She was real. I was sure of it. And whatever had happened to her, whatever I had unleashed by opening that drawer, wasn't finished with me. The knocking never stopped. It followed me everywhere, a constant, relentless thud in the back of my mind, like a ticking clock counting down to something terrible. I tried calling the police again, but they wouldn't take me seriously. They told me they were still investigating, but the way they said it, I could tell they thought I was just some lunatic who was imagining things. They hadn't found anything at my apartment. No photos, no drawer, no creepy messages, nothing. It's like everything had been wiped clean. I was alone in this, and the worst part, I had no idea what would come next. I didn't sleep for days after that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that girl's face, her twisted limbs, her lifeless eyes boring into mine. The knocking followed me everywhere. I could hear it even when there was nothing around, like it was coming from inside my own head. It was driving me insane, and I couldn't escape it no matter how far I ran. I tried everything. I switched motels every night, slept in my car, even thought about going to a therapist. But how do you explain something like this without sounding completely unhinged? "Hi, Doc. I'm being followed by a dead girl I found in a mystery box from the dark web." Yeah, that'd go over well. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my family. I figured the less they knew, the better. But part of me was afraid that if I got too close to someone, whatever this thing was would come for them too. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. Something had to give. So, against every screaming instinct in my body, I went back to my apartment. I had to face it. The cops had found nothing, and if I didn't go back and figure this out, I was sure it was going to haunt me until I lost my mind completely. I got there late in the afternoon, figuring daylight would help me keep a grip on reality. The building was quiet, too quiet. I half expected the place to be different somehow, like I'd come back to something completely unrecognizable. But it was the same old building, the same creaky elevator, the same peeling paint. Everything looked exactly as it had before. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I unlocked the door to my apartment. The smell hit me first, stale, musty, but not the rotting stench I'd expected. The place was cold, like it hadn't been lived in for years, but nothing seemed out of place. The photos I had on the wall, the furniture, everything was just normal. But I knew better. I locked the door behind me, not wanting any escape routes. If something was going to happen, I needed to face it head on. I made my way to the closet. It was still there, the drawer. Closed this time like nothing had ever happened. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at it. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shaky and shallow. I had no idea what I was expecting, but the silence was the worst part. No knocking, no voices. Just a thick, heavy quiet that pressed down on me like a weight. I knelt down, reached for the drawer and pulled it open. Empty. Not a single thing inside. No photos, no phone, not even the fabric or straps I had seen before. It was just an empty drawer in an old closet. I almost laughed, the relief so overwhelming I thought I might collapse. Maybe it was over. Maybe it had all just been a series of hallucinations brought on by stress and paranoia. Maybe I was finally free. But that's when I heard it. The soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from just outside my apartment door. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My eyes were glued to the front door, waiting, listening, as the footsteps came closer. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Then, the footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but there was nothing. No knocking, no voice, just silence. I took a step toward the door, thinking maybe it was a neighbor, maybe I was just hearing things. But before I could reach the door, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen lit up with a single message from an unknown number. "Open the door." I stared at the message, my blood running cold. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but something about that message, it was like I didn't have a choice. My hands moved on their own as I reached for the doorknob. The door swung open, and for a moment I didn't see anything, just the empty hallway, lit by the flickering overhead lights. I felt a weird sense of relief, like maybe it was all in my head again. But then I looked down. There, on the ground, was a package. Small, plain, wrapped in brown paper with no markings, no address. Just like the mystery box that had started this whole nightmare, I didn't want to touch it. God, I wanted to leave it there and walk away, pretend it wasn't there, but I knew that wasn't an option. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop until I faced it. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I brought it inside and set it on the table. I hesitated for a long time, staring at the package, trying to convince myself not to open it. But I knew that I had no choice. This was it. This was the moment that would either end everything or drag me deeper into whatever hell this was. I peeled back the brown paper, my heart pounding in my chest, and inside was something that nearly made me vomit. A severed finger. It was small, delicate, like it belonged to a child. The skin was pale and wrinkled, like it had been submerged in water for too long. The nail was chipped, and the base of the finger was jagged, like it had been ripped off rather than cut cleanly. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat as I stared at it in horror. And then I saw it. Wrapped around the base of the finger was a small strip of paper, like a note. I had to force myself to touch it, to unwrap the paper, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it open. The note was handwritten, in the same messy scrawl as before. "Finish what you started." My vision blurred as I read the words, my mind spinning. Finish what I started? What the hell was that supposed to mean? What had I started? I hadn't done anything. This had been forced on me. But before I could even begin to process it, my phone buzzed again. Another message, another unknown number. Check the closet. No, no way. I wasn't going back in there. Not after what I'd seen, not after what had happened before. But again, it was like I had no control. My feet moved on their own, carrying me back to the closet. The door creaked open slowly, and there it was again, the drawer. It was open this time, just a crack, like it had been waiting for me. I didn't want to look inside. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me, but I knew I had no choice. I reached out, gripping the edge of the drawer, and pulled it all the way open. Inside, lying on top of the wood, was something that made my heart stop. Another photograph. This one wasn't of the girl, though. This one was of me, taken from behind, standing in the very same hallway where I'd found the package, the timestamp on the corner of the photo. It was from 10 minutes ago. I dropped the photo, backing away from the closet as my mind raced. Someone was watching me. Someone had been there, standing behind me, taking that photo while I picked up the package. I didn't even hear them. How could I not have noticed? And then the knocking started again. Louder this time, more frantic, coming from every direction at once. I ran. I don't even remember how I made it out of the apartment. My brain was in full panic mode, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, How many turns I took, I couldn't escape it. The knocking. It followed me everywhere, an unrelenting rhythm pounding in the back of my mind. I ended up in my car, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I floored it out of the parking lot, not caring where I was going as long as it was far away from that apartment. I drove like a madman, weaving through traffic, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The streetlights blurred past me, but all I could focus on was the sound, the knocking. It wasn't coming from inside the apartment anymore. It was coming from inside my head, like someone had taken up residence in my skull and was banging on the walls, demanding to be let out. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was going, just trying to outrun the inevitable. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing. Just empty roads, the faint glow of the city fading behind me as I sped down the highway. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I pulled off the road and parked at a rest stop. I needed to breathe, to think, to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring out into the darkness, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But deep down, I knew there was no escaping this. Whatever I had unleashed, it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I reached for my phone, hoping for some kind of answer, anything that would make this all make sense. Another message was waiting for me. Look in the trunk. My heart stopped. I hadn't opened the trunk since I'd left my apartment. There was no reason for anything to be in there, unless someone had put it there. I swallowed hard, my hand trembling as I reached for the door handle. I got out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin as I walked around to the back of the vehicle. The trunk was heavy, heavier than I remembered, and when I popped it open, the stench hit me like a punch to the gut. That familiar, rancid smell of rot and decay, only now it was so strong that I gagged, nearly doubling over as bile rose in my throat. Lying in the trunk, wrapped in plastic, was the body of a child. Small, frail, with matted hair and pale skin that looked like it had been decomposing for days. My vision blurred as I stared down at her. It was the girl from the photographs, the same one I'd seen crawling out of the floor, the same one who'd whispered those haunting words. Her face was twisted in agony, her eyes wide and lifeless, staring up at me like she was accusing me of something, like I was responsible for her death. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, trying to make sense of it. How the hell did she get in there? How long had she been there? My mind raced with questions, but the answers didn't matter. None of it mattered. All that mattered was that I was fucked. Really, truly fucked. And then my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what it said, but I couldn't stop myself. My hands moved on their own, bringing the screen up to my face. You did this. I stared at the message, my breath coming in short gasps, my mind reeling. What the hell did that mean? I didn't do anything. I'd just bought a stupid mystery box. That was it. That was all. But the more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense. Sick, twisted sense. I had opened the box. I had found the drawer. I had seen the photos. I had let it in. Whatever this thing was, this girl, this presence, I had invited it into my life the moment I opened that box. I had started it, and now I had to finish it. But how? How the fuck was I supposed to finish something like this? I looked back down at the body in the trunk, bile rising in my throat again. There was no getting out of this. The police wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed myself. But the knocking, it was louder now, more urgent, like it was coming from right behind me. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty rest stop and the faint hum of the highway in the distance. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. The girl. She was standing at the edge of the parking lot, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me with those hollow, lifeless eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, frozen in place. but my body wouldn't listen. I was rooted to the spot, my breath shallow, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The girl took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, like each step took immense effort. Her limbs were still twisted, her skin grey and rotting, but her eyes, those horrible dead eyes, were locked on mine. "Finish it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. I shook my head, backing away, my hands raised in a futile gesture. "I didn't do anything," I muttered, my voice trembling. "I didn't—" But she kept coming, her eyes never leaving mine. "Finish it." The knocking grew louder, more insistent, like it was coming from inside me now. My head throbbed with the pressure of it, like my skull was about to crack open. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, trying to drown out the sound, but it was useless. It was everywhere. The girl was right in front of me now, her face inches from mine. Her skin was peeling, her breath foul and rotten, but it was her eyes that terrified me the most. Those empty, accusing eyes. "Finish it," she whispered one last time, her breath cold against my skin. And then she was gone. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, like the world had gone completely still. I was alone, kneeling in the parking lot, the body of the girl still lying in my trunk. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring at the body, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I got back in my car, closed the trunk, and drove away. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what's going to happen next. But I do know one thing. Whatever I started that night with the mystery box, it's not over. It will never be over.